This morning's gospel reading includes Matthew's account of Jesus' first sermon. It's so brief, if you're not paying attention, you may miss it altogether. It's a single sentence sermon which more or less says, turn your life around because the new rule of God is coming. With John the Baptizer in prison, Jesus has taken up John's message word for word. But although his words were the same as John's, the tone of the two messages seemed to be different to me. John addresses some of his listening audience as a brood of vipers, promising a future of unquenchable fire for those who ignore his reproaches and criticisms. But Matthew's gospel paints Jesus as much more compassionate and loving than John in both deed and word. He ministers to the sick, and he promises a future of blessing for the meek, the merciful, and those who are persecuted. His primary message was still about the coming rule of God, but somehow it sounds more like a promise of hope than a threat of doom. I think sometimes that happens. Sometimes I think the message of God starts out one way, and then someone or a group of someones put their own spin on it, and before you know it, God's message of redemption and salvation gets twisted into something that's almost unrecognizable. And when someone else takes up the torch of proclaiming God's love, it can sound altogether different from what people have been used to hearing. 49 years ago, MCC churches took up the torch of proclaiming God's all-inclusive love. And sometimes you can hardly recognize our message as the same one given by God to our centuries-old mainstream Christian neighbor churches. Members of the LGBTQ community have been called even worse names than a brood of vipers by those neighbors over the years. And we've received our fair share of promised hellfire and damnation. But then along came Troy Perry, who God called to take up the torch with his launching of metropolitan community churches. And MCC churches rose up from that call, proclaiming a healing message of God's love for the crushed down spirits of gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgender people, and promising a future of blessing to anyone with ears to hear. And our message has continued to be one of justice and compassion for everyone. Firmly grounded in God's radically inclusive love for all people, MCC arrived on a religious landscape characterized by Christian denominations that proclaimed us sinful simply because of who and how we love. And in my opinion, we have returned to God's intended message of salvation for all humankind, but especially for those who are marginalized. It's interesting to note where Jesus' ministry began. One would have thought that if he would have wanted to appeal to a larger audience, he would have started out in Jerusalem, the religious and political hub of the Jewish people. But he didn't, according to Matthew. Instead, he withdrew to Galilee. It's been said that Galilee was at the crossroads of international trade routes. It was well acquainted with foreign armies as they marched through or stopped to occupy the land. And so it had its share of Jewish residents, but there were also Gentiles. And everyone in that place was hungry for some good news. And as if to move even further from Jerusalem than his backwater hometown of Nazareth, Jesus takes up residence in an equally middle-of-nowhere fishing village called Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, which would become the home base for his ministry. Logically speaking, Jesus was doing it all wrong. He would never reach the number of people that he could have reached in a larger city like Jerusalem. He wouldn't get the publicity he needed spending his days lurking around the fishing boats of this community and spending time with common fishermen with no political influence. It may have been a lousy place for ministry if he was interested in publicity and popularity ratings, but apparently it was ideal if he was interested in sharing the good news of God's grace with those who were poor and marginalized. Apparently, in fact, it was the perfect place. Sometimes I've wished this church was located in a larger metropolitan area like Austin or Dallas. The LGBT community is larger there, and there seems to be more resources available and more organizations with whom we could partner. It just seems to make more sense. But if we are really answering the call to proclaim God's love for those who are marginalized, you couldn't ask for a better place than right where we are. In a city where 30% of its population lives below the poverty line, we are ripe for a poverty and homelessness ministry at this church. We live in a city that is 1/4 Hispanic or Latino, and most of them are Mexican, offering us another opportunity for ministry, this one to immigrants. Of those who attend church in our city, 42% identify as Southern Baptist and 20% are Catholic. And that means that almost 2/3 of the congregations in our area are receiving messages from the pulpit that members of the LGBTQ population are abominations. And if that's not potential for ministry, then I don't know what is. Because of the conservative nature of our city's religion and culture, the HIV community is stigmatized and consequently closeted, which only contributes to the infection rate. Yet another opportunity for ministry. God has called us to this place for such a time as this. And the question is whether or not we are willing to answer that call. In our gospel reading, Jesus calls the first 4 members of his merry band of disciples. He calls Simon Peter, his brother Andrew, and the brothers James and John. All of them made their living fishing at the seaside village of Capernaum. They seem to have no gifts or qualifications for discipleship other than they were there. Jesus said, "Join me," and they did. There was no application that asked for one's job history or a list of references. There were no expectations of success, but neither were there any promises. The same is true for you and me. We have been called to join God in ministry in this small city of Waco, Texas. No skills are needed. Just a willingness to do what we can. There are no promises that we will succeed, but God doesn't call us to success, only to obedience. There are lots of opportunity for ministry. In fact, the city is ripe with opportunity. I believe this church is at a position in its history when we need to make some important decisions. Decisions that will not only have an impact on others, but will also have an impact on our own vibrancy. I believe that if we aren't intentional about revitalization, we can expect to move into a state of decline. And decline left unchecked ultimately leads to death. God is calling us to revitalization. And that revitalization means taking up ministry that not only serves our neighbors, but energizes us and gives us a new sense of purpose. We need to assess who we are and who is our neighbor. And we need to observe how God is showing up in our neighborhood. And then we need to discern how we can join God's work in our neighborhood. It's up to us. We can continue to mend our nets doing what we've always done in the past and satisfy ourselves with a meager return for our efforts. Or we can embrace a new way of doing church, a new way of fishing, one in which there are no guarantees except the good pleasure of the one we follow. Let's do it. Let's be courageous and step out in faith. The time is ripe for new ministry. Our location is right for it. And all we need are a few people willing to discern God's call and to answer it with a resounding yes. I want to invite you to join me in serious, intentional prayer for discernment of the next phase of our church. Join me in reflection on who we are and who God is calling us to be. Join me in looking around at our neighborhood and seeing who our neighbor really is, so we can join with what God is already doing. And as you join me, may God bless you abundantly in your efforts to bless others. Amen.